What if I tell you that learning chess principles and guidelines, all these efforts that you made, is totally worthless if you don't know this, if you don't understand pawns? If I tell you things like hanging pawns, double pawns, isolated pawns, triple pawns, what is the word that you're thinking about right now? Let me guess. Weakness. You think that all these characteristics for a pawn are weaknesses in chess. But it's wrong. My goal today is to make you understand pawn structures. And I really think that this video will change the way you play chess overnight. Principle number 1. If you're playing against a cutie, a guy or a girl, develop pieces before developing feelings. Let's get to the serious stuff now. Principle number 1. Doubled pawns are weak when they are on an open file. Here, these two pawns are doubled, and there is an open file. And usually what happens, the pawn that is in front is usually weaker than the pawn that is in the back. To exploit this, black is just gonna attack the pawn, the bishop and the knight are attacking this poor pawn. The only way to defend it is to bring the queen, but then, because there is an open file, this rook comes here, attacking the pawn one more time, and there is no way that you can defend it. White played this move, and then they lost the pawn this way. Doubled pawns are not always weak. In this position, for instance, if you bring the bishop here, should your opponent takes this bishop and create double pawns? Yes or no? What do you think? Because taking the bishop and the pawn takes, yes, these are double pawns, but they are super strong because they are controlling very important squares in the center of the board, and they are not on an open file, which means there is still this pawn here, which means putting a rook here does not attack the front pawn. And also, this double pawn allows this rook to be in play. The file of the rook is now open. So instead, your opponent here shouldn't have taken the bishop. Instead, what he could have done is just retreat his bishop. Now you take. When he takes, he has double pawns. He opened this file for the rook that is now active. So doubled pawns are not necessarily a weakness. Principle number 2. An isolated pawn, which means a pawn that cannot be defended by a pawn that is on the adjacent file, is weak, again, if there is an open file and your opponent has a rook that can attack this pawn. In this situation, if you're playing with white, the best move is to attack this pawn with the rook because the file is open. He's gonna try to defend it, and then you bring your pieces in the center by playing this move, and you see that the bishop, the knight, and the rook are now attacking this pawn. On the next move, you're just gonna put the queen here or here, attacking this pawn again until this pawn is yours, basically. In this kind of situation, when there is an open file, an isolated pawn is weak. But an isolated pawn can also be good in your position. When you calculate to take this bishop, to exchange it, usually what you're considering in your mind is, okay, what if he takes with the knight? What if he takes with the queen? But you don't think about the fact that he could take with the pawn because you think, well, my opponent is not going to create an isolated pawn for himself. But it turns out that here, having an isolated pawn is not so bad. The file is not open, which means bringing a rook here would not attack directly this pawn because of this one that is blocking the way. Also, you brought this pawn to the center, which means this pawn is controlling a very important square, so your pieces cannot get there. This is a good example of an isolated pawn that is not a big deal. Having also this pawn here opens the file for you to be able to come and attack with your pieces. Taking with the pawn is actually the best option. The next principle, the best formula to fight against an isolated pawn is to control the square that is just behind it with a piece. Usually with a knight. Knight is the best piece to put on this square. And here black is totally winning for a simple reason. They're gonna use this to their advantage by pushing this pawn. And you see what's happening. There is a pin, which means this pawn cannot take this pawn. And on the next move, you're just gonna take the pawn. You're gonna be a pawn up in an endgame. Why? Just because you didn't allow this pawn to advance. You wanna fix the weakness by putting a piece here, and then use this to your advantage with this kind of moves. Here there is an isolated pawn again, that is a good one, and the next principle is, Whenever you have an isolated pawn, you have to play dynamically in your position. Here, for instance, in this position, having this pawn in the center allows you to have more space, to control important squares, and why not to be pushed. You can play for this push and opening up the position, or attacking on the side and creating a second weakness. And you're gonna try everything like this, pushing the pawn, pushing on d5, and try to play dynamic chess because the endgames are bad for you. But there is an exception. It's the next principle. If you have an isolated pawn and your opponent exchanged minor pieces, try to also exchange the rooks, because not having the rooks on the board allows this pawn to not be attacked. If there was like rooks now, it would be extremely complicated to actually defend this pawn. Basically, in queen endgames, it doesn't really matter to have an isolated pawn because there is no other piece that can come and attack this pawn. This position actually is totally equal. If your opponent exchange minor pieces, try to also exchange rooks, so your opponent cannot put more pressure on your isolated pawn. The next principle is for what we call a backward pawn. You have to strive for the control of the square that is just in front of the backward pawn and put a piece. Ideally, you want to create a blockade. The reason why you put a piece here is you don't want the backward pawn to be pushed and to be exchanged. And for this to happen, you want to be exchanging all pieces that control the square in front. Here, Smyslov is playing with the white pieces, and his opponent has a backward pawn. What do we do when we have a backward pawn? Now you know, we want to control the square that is right in front of it with a piece, so we don't let this backward pawn get pushed and get exchanged against another pawn. Smyslov attacked this bishop by pushing this pawn, and his opponent had two choices really, go here or here. Which one you think is best actually here? The best move was to retreat the bishop here, but for some reason we don't like this kind of moves. We like to go forward because we think, you know what, if I start to play like this defensively, maybe I'm gonna get totally crushed. Strategically, his opponent made a big blunder. It's a positional mistake to exchange the piece that controls this square and getting rid of it, because then you lose grip basically on this square, because now Smyslov took as quickly as he could, I think. And now what you have to do, there is only one piece left that controls this square, so you try to get rid of it and exchange. Boom. And now you see what's happening. His opponent is left with a horrible bishop because the pawns are on dark squares and this is a dark square bishop, and all you have to do is come with your knight to this beautiful square. If he has a backward pawn, I put a piece in the square just in front of it. That's my goal. And if you're thinking that you lose this pawn, you don't, because the rook attacks the queen moves, you attack it again, and when he moves, there is this amazing triple fork that you love so much. The next misconception is tripled pawns are always bad, but that's not the case. Tripled pawns are only bad if it's very easy for your opponent to attack them. Otherwise, it can be a strength, and especially the most advanced pawn. You have to look, is it easy for this guy to attack this pawn? Yes or no? Can I use it to my advantage? And here, let me show you a 14 moves game between two amateurs, how it went. This guy brought his rook to the center to control the d-file, which means this one cannot castle, otherwise he would lose the rook. Now he moved the rook to the side. This guy played f4, which is a very good move. The best way to fight against a knight is to take away his points of control. And here it was this square. If he cannot go to the center here, this knight becomes totally crap. That's why this move was amazing, but that's not the purpose of this video. Now he castled, but look, you're gonna see that even having tripled pawns is not gonna do anything here. He attacks with the bishop this pawn, you defend it, and he tries to reroute the knight because he saw that his knight was crap. Now you attack the rook moves, you don't exchange pieces as much as you can when you're in a better endgame. You propose this exchange, which would allow you to create a passer. He's not gonna take, he's just gonna wait. You wait, that's fine. He waits, now you take, because it allows you to come with the rook on the back rank. And when he tries to exchange rooks, this guy played very well. He didn't exchange it, he attacks a pawn. And look, You thought that triple pawns were bad, but look, it allows this kind of tactic here, pushing it. Because when he takes, you take this one, and now you see what's happening. You have a passer. This king is going to come to the center, and it's going to be extremely hard for black. They ended up losing pretty quickly because of this passer on the A file. You see that tripled pawns are not necessarily bad. It depends. Ask yourself, can he attack my front pawn very easily? Yes or no? It depends, because tripled pawns can be actually a strength in your position. The next principle is for what we call hanging pawns, which means pawns in the center that are together but that cannot be protected by a pawn on the adjacent files. These pawns, the way to fight against them is to not let them advance. If he manages to push, it would open up the bishop, it would create all sorts of imbalances, some sort of attack. So what you want to be doing is controlling this square and this square with your pieces so he cannot push them and become active. For instance here, this is exactly what white did by doubling on the D file that was open. So you control this square very well. Almost every single piece is acting in one direction, and if you don't understand pawn structures, you don't know what your plan is here, for instance. You wouldn't understand, okay, he has hanging pawns. I need to make sure that I control this square and this square, because whenever he pushes hanging pawns, now I know the pattern. I know his pieces are gonna come in the center and they're gonna become strong. So I need to control these squares, and this is the reason why white put their pieces like this. But you need to understand pawns to be able to understand this. The next principle is hanging pawns are not always bad if they can get pushed. And here, Bobby Fischer is playing with the black pieces. His opponent is attacking this pawn and made a mistake because now Fischer is pushing his pawn. You see these hanging pawns, whenever you manage to push, you're taking what we call space. You're going to have more space for your pieces. Also, this pawn here is kind of fixing this weakness there. Fischer is going to use this to his advantage. Now the knight comes here, and look, Fischer comes straight away and uses this file to his advantage just because he managed to push, which means his opponent cannot push the pawn, otherwise this pawn would take. That's one of the advantages of having hanging pawns. Here his opponent played this, Fischer attacked the rook moved, attacking this pawn. There are two pieces attacking it, which means Fischer doesn't have time to take this pawn yet. So he defends, his opponent does the same, and now there is this amazing move, because when the knight moves, you come to the center with your piece, attacking this rook. And you see what's happening. When you have hanging pawns like this, you can feel that black has way more space than his opponent, especially when he pushes a pawn, so you always have to be careful. The next principle is more like a misconception that chess amateurs have when they look at what we call a passed pawn. A passed pawn means this pawn cannot be stopped by another pawn. He's passed basically these two pawns, right? That cannot stop him anymore in exchange against this one. Usually this is a strength, and when you have a passed pawn, they tell you, okay, it's amazing. In most books you will see this, but sometimes when there is a piece especially that is just in the square in front of the pawn that stops the pawn, you would rather not have that pawn rather than having it. Because look, it's blocking the fact that you have it. Now you're not going to be able to move this pawn anymore. And this rook is basically hitting against concrete. He's not doing anything. You would rather not have this pawn so the rook can actually play. But the fact that you have it and it's blocked very nicely by a knight, it reduces the mobility of your pieces. And with white, you kind of don't know what you can do actually in this position anymore. A protected pass pawn is not always an advantage. So the next principle now, with this position, you have a passer. A good passer is when the square in front of him is not controlled by a piece and he's not being blocked, so you can push him. Here, the best move is to push this pawn and take space this way with your pieces and creating opening lines against this king. One day coming here, and then he's going to block the pawn, but that's a bit too late. You're going to push on the other side, creating a second weakness. He's going to try to defend like this, playing moves. And for instance, if he goes queen e6, trying to put pressure on this, having this kind of space for your pieces creates this kind of tactics, like taking this pawn, for instance, because he cannot take. Otherwise, you take the rook and you won a pawn. Extremely important. when you have a passer, just pay attention to the square in front. Which means if you're playing against a passer, you know that you need to put a knight there. So just to summarize, there is no such thing in chess as a pawn structure being good or bad. It depends on the position. Also, when it's about hanging pawns, you want to control the square in front. When it's double pawns, isolated pawns, you want to be playing dynamically. You don't want to just wait and go on an endgame and then you may lose because yes, in the endgame usually these pawn structures are really bad. And also when your opponent has a weak pawn structure, he has a weak backward pawn for instance, the pawn must be contained, which means you need to block him. Don't let him advance the pawn that is weak. Always put your pieces accordingly, okay? I hope this cleared a lot of misconceptions when it comes to pawns. I'm pretty sure if you understood everything I said today, that your rating will change overnight. I'll see you on the next video.